What happens when an innocent trinket holds a dark, twisted secret? A simple figurine, Hello Kitty, but this one is different. It hides a terrifying curse, one that traps souls for eternity. Curious? You won't believe what happens next. Stay with me to uncover the shocking truth behind the Hello Kitty murder. If you dare. It was an ordinary afternoon in a quiet neighborhood. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. Lily, an avid collector of vintage items, was on her usual treasure hunt. She wandered into a small, dimly lit antique store at the corner of Maple Street. The smell of dust and aged wood filled the air, mingling with a faint, almost sickly sweet scent. Her eyes skimmed over shelves cluttered with forgotten trinkets and porcelain dolls. But then something caught her eye. A small Hello Kitty figurine perched on a dusty shelf in the back. It looked innocent enough, its signature bow brightly red against its pale face. But there was something strange about it, the way it seemed to watch her. Lily walked closer, her heart beating faster for reasons she couldn't explain. She reached out to touch it. The porcelain was cold under her fingertips. Her eyes locked onto its face, the painted smile almost too perfect, too still. As she lifted the figurine, a strange sound echoed from somewhere in the store, a soft, almost imperceptible creak. She froze. Something was wrong. The store seemed too quiet now, too still. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned the Hello Kitty figure in her hands. There, hidden beneath its base, was a faint stain, dark, almost black. Lily's fingers trembled as she examined it closer. It wasn't just dirt. It looked like something else, something darker. Her mind raced, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Then, suddenly, the store door slammed shut. A gust of cold air swept across the room. Lily's stomach dropped. She felt trapped. Before she could move, the lights flickered. The once comforting antique shop now felt suffocating. The figurine in her hand grew heavier, as if the weight of the world was shifting onto her. The air turned thick, clinging to her skin. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for something, anything, to explain what was happening. But nothing seemed right. She noticed something else, a shadow moving in the corner of her vision. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but then it moved again, closer. The sensation of being watched became overwhelming. Lily slowly turned toward the source of the shadow. A figure stood at the far end of the room, barely visible in the dim light. She couldn't make out its face, but she could feel its gaze drilling into her. Her throat tightened, panic clawing at her chest. Without thinking, she dropped the Hello Kitty figurine, watching as it shattered on the floor with a sickening crunch. The store door creaked open. A low, guttural voice whispered from the shadows. "Why did you touch it?" Lily's legs buckled beneath her. Her breath came in short, frantic gasps as the temperature in the room plummeted. She turned to run, but something held her back. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the floorboards groaning as though alive. Her pulse quickened. The figure emerged from the darkness, its face now visible. It wasn't human. It was something else. Its eyes were hollow, endless black pits, and the smile that twisted across its face was not one of joy. It was something far more sinister. Lily backed away, heart pounding, hands trembling. The thing stepped closer, its presence suffocating, consuming the air around her. "Did you think you could escape?" it whispered. Her feet dragged, unwilling to move any faster, as if the floor itself were holding her in place. The figurine's shattered pieces glinted on the floor like broken teeth. She stumbled, falling to her knees. The shadowed figure stood over her, its breath cold against her skin. A chill ran through her body, and in that moment, she realized something. The Hello Kitty figurine wasn't just a doll. It had been a warning, a sign that once touched, it couldn't be put down. And those who did never left. Lily's breath hitched in her throat, panic rising like a tidal wave. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. But the room had closed in around her, the walls pressing tighter with every passing second. The figure loomed above her, its presence suffocating, its hollow eyes never blinking. "Do you know what you've done?" the voice rasped, barely a whisper, yet it seemed to reverberate through her very soul. Lily tried to speak, but no words came. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against her chest, squeezing the life out of her. She forced herself to her feet, her legs shaking violently beneath her, but the figure didn't move. It stood there, watching, waiting. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, each beat louder than the last. The floor beneath her feet was slick with something. Blood, sweat. She couldn't tell, but it made her slip, almost crashing to the ground again. The figure chuckled, a low, guttural sound that scraped at her nerves. "Running won't help you now," it said, stepping closer, the coldness of its body leaking into the air. Lily wanted to scream, but her voice was swallowed up by the oppressive silence. Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but all she saw were the dark corners of the room closing in. Her fingers brushed the broken pieces of the Hello Kitty figurine, sharp shards that glinted in the low light. Suddenly, an idea sparked in her mind. She grabbed one of the shards, her fingers slipping over the jagged edges, but she didn't care. She had to do something. With all her remaining strength, she lunged at the figure. The shard held out in front of her like a weapon, but it didn't flinch. It didn't even move. The smile on its face only grew wider. Lily's heart sank as she realized her attempt was futile. The shard passed through the figure's chest like smoke, not even making contact. It wasn't real. None of this was real. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by her futile struggle. Then, with a sudden motion, it reached out, grabbing her wrist with cold, deathly fingers. Lily gasped, feeling an ice-cold grip tighten around her arm, dragging her closer to the shadowed form. "Why did you have to disturb me?" it hissed, its voice now like nails on a chalkboard. She felt her limbs grow heavy, her body growing numb. The cold seeped into her bones, freezing her in place. The floor beneath her feet began to crack, splitting apart in jagged lines. Lily's vision blurred as the figure's face came closer, its smile stretched impossibly wide, like something out of a nightmare. She could hear the sound of her own breathing, shallow and frantic, but the noise felt distant. As her strength waned, she realized that she had entered something far darker than she had imagined. A trap, a curse, and now there was no way out. The last thing she saw was the shattered Hello Kitty figurine, its broken pieces scattered across the floor. And then everything went black. In the darkness, she could feel herself being pulled, dragged down into something cold, something endless. There was no escape, no way to undo the mistake she had made. Only the endless, suffocating darkness, and the eyes of the shadowed figure watching, waiting for its next victim. That Lily's consciousness flickered, her senses blurring between what was real and what was not. She felt like she was floating, lost in an abyss. The cold grip had loosened, but the fear remained, an insidious presence that pressed on her mind like a weight. Her body felt distant, as if it no longer belonged to her. She tried to move, but it was as though the darkness itself had wrapped around her limbs, paralyzing her. And then, just as suddenly as the cold had gripped her, the sensation of weightlessness was replaced by a sharp, blinding light. It stung her eyes, and for a moment, she couldn't tell if she was dreaming or awake. The sound of her own labored breathing filled the air, quick and shallow. Lily opened her eyes, squinting against the harsh brightness that burned her vision. But what she saw next was far worse than anything she could have imagined. The store was gone. The dusty shelves, the old wooden floor, everything was gone. She stood now in a vast, empty void, a place that had no beginning and no end. The ground beneath her was smooth, black, like glass, and the sky above was a swirling mass of dark clouds, flickering with eerie, unnatural light. The air smelled metallic, sharp, and wrong. A voice echoed in the vast emptiness, low and almost unrecognizable, like a whisper carried by the wind. "You shouldn't have touched it." Lily's pulse spiked, the fear returning in full force. She turned in every direction, desperate to find something, anything, to cling to. But there was nothing, only the void. A cold, ghostly laughter filled the air, sending a chill crawling up her spine. "Welcome to your new home," the voice said, and this time it was unmistakably familiar. The shadowed figure, its hollow eyes locked onto hers from somewhere in the darkness, had found her. Lily stumbled back, her legs trembling beneath her. There was no escape here. The figure stepped forward, its body a blur of shadows, shifting and twisting as it moved. "You didn't just touch the figurine," it said, its voice now a low growl that made the very air tremble. "You took something that didn't belong to you." Lily's heart raced, her thoughts chaotic. "What are you?" she managed to gasp, her voice barely a whisper. The figure's smile widened, its teeth now visible, sharp, jagged, and inhuman. "I am what you fear most," it whispered back, its voice now a hiss, like steam escaping from a pressurized pipe. "You disturbed something ancient, something cursed." The ground beneath Lily's feet seemed to shift again, and suddenly, the darkness around her began to pulse. With each pulse, the air grew thicker, as though the very fabric of the void was closing in on her. The figure's form began to distort, its edges becoming jagged, like it was made of smoke and broken glass. "You will never leave," it declared, its voice now an inescapable echo that reverberated through her entire being. Lily staggered backward, feeling the weight of her mistake crushing down on her. She had thought it was just a harmless collectible, just a simple doll, but it was far more than that. It was the doorway to something far darker than she could comprehend, and she had opened it. The void around her darkened further, and the figure began to disappear into the swirling shadows. But its eyes, they stayed locked onto hers, unblinking, forever haunting. "You'll learn soon enough," the voice said, as the last remnants of its form dissolved into the void. Lily stood there, alone in the suffocating darkness, as time itself seemed to freeze around her. Her heart thundered in her chest, but she could do nothing but wait. For in this place there was no escape, only endless night, and the terrifying truth she now knew. The Hello Kitty figurine was not just a doll. It was the key, and she had unlocked something that could never be undone. That Lily's breath quickened, each inhale sharp and ragged in the suffocating dark. Her mind screamed for answers, for a way out, but all she could hear was the eerie silence pressing in from all sides. She tried to move, to run, but her feet felt as if they were bound to the black glass beneath her, as if the very void was holding her in place. The air grew colder, almost unbearable. A low, growling sound vibrated through the ground. Lily's eyes widened as a ripple spread across the dark sky above, distorting it like the surface of water disturbed by something beneath. The void seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in unnatural rhythms. She could feel it, something shifting just out of sight, something moving in the shadows, drawing nearer with each passing second. The sensation of being watched grew unbearable. Lily spun around, her heart racing. Out of the darkness, figures began to form. Not one, not two, but countless shapes, emerging from the shadows like phantoms of the night, their eyes glowing with the same hollow emptiness she had seen in the figure that had spoken to her. They weren't human. They were something worse. They were fragments, twisted remnants of lost souls, trapped in this place, bound by the curse of the Hello Kitty figurine. Lily staggered back, feeling the overwhelming weight of their presence. She could hear them whispering to one another in a language she couldn't understand, their voices a cacophony of dissonant, maddening murmurs. One of them reached out, its long, bony hand stretching toward her, its fingers like claws scraping against the air. "Join us," a voice croaked, its sound like broken glass. Another figure stepped forward, its face a distorted mask of pain and rage, its eyes burned with the same empty hollowness. "We were once like you," it hissed, its voice trembling with sorrow and fury. "We thought we could control it. We thought we could escape." Lily's knees buckled, her body trembling with fear. She had to get out. She had to find a way. Her eyes darted around the shifting shadows, desperately searching for any sign of light, any trace of an escape. But the darkness seemed endless, swallowing her hope with every passing second. The figures circled her, their hollow eyes never leaving her. Their whispering grew louder, more frantic, until it became a maddening chant, drowning out all reason. "Touch it!" they hissed, their voices merging together in a chorus of despair. "Touch it, and become one of us." Lily felt the weight of their words press against her chest. She was suffocating, drowning in a sea of fear and hopelessness. Her fingers twitched, her mind reeling as the memories of the Hello Kitty figurine flooded her thoughts. What had she done? Had she unknowingly unleashed this curse? Had she become a part of it? The figures began to move closer, their bodies twisting, flickering like broken shadows. Lily could hear their whispers more clearly now, each word a shiver down her spine. "You can't escape," they said. "You will never leave. You belong to us." Lily's heart raced in her chest, the pulse of panic building in her throat. She backed away, trying to distance herself from the phantoms, but it was useless. No matter which direction she turned, they followed. They were everywhere. And then the voice echoed again, louder, more insistent, more powerful. "You should have never touched it." The ground beneath her feet trembled, cracks splitting open, the black glass breaking apart as though it was coming undone. And in that moment, Lily realized the horrifying truth. It wasn't just the figurine that had cursed her. It was the very act of disturbing something that should have remained untouched. The curse wasn't bound by time or space. It followed the foolish, the curious, the reckless. It had claimed her. And now, there was nothing she could do but accept her fate. The darkness closed in on her, suffocating her vision, swallowing her whole. And in the endless void, she could hear the whispers of the others, those who had touched the figurine before her. And she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she had become one of them. The whispers grew louder, their voices filling her mind with their desperate pleas and tormented cries. Lily felt herself being pulled into the swirling darkness, the ground beneath her feet collapsing into an abyss that threatened to consume her completely. Her heart pounded harder with each passing moment, but it was no use. There was no escaping. The void was all around her now, suffocating, pressing in from all directions. She could hear her own breath, shallow and erratic, but it felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. The figures circled her once again, their distorted forms stretching out of the darkness, their hollow eyes gleaming with an eerie satisfaction. One of them, its features barely recognizable, reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers trembling with an unnatural hunger. "Welcome to eternity," it rasped, the words like ice scraping against her skin. "This is where you'll stay. Forever." Lily's mind raced, fighting against the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that threatened to overtake her. She refused to accept it. She had to find a way out. Her eyes darted around the infinite blackness, searching for any glimmer of light, any sign that there was still something outside of this cursed place. But there was nothing. The figures closed in on her, their hollow eyes filled with nothing but despair. They had been trapped here, just like her, victims of a curse that had bound them to the darkness for eternity. And now she was one of them. The shadowed figure, the one that had spoken to her first, appeared before her once more, its twisted smile growing wider, more sinister. "You thought you could escape," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "But once you touch it, you become part of us. You belong to the darkness now." Lily's throat tightened as a wave of cold dread washed over her. She could feel the weight of the curse wrapping itself around her like chains, pulling her deeper into the void. But then something flickered in the distance, a faint light. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Lily's breath hitched as she turned toward it, desperation flooding her veins. Could it be? Could there be a way out after all? The figures shrieked, their voices twisting in agony as they reached for her. But she ignored them, focusing only on the distant glow. Her heart raced, her legs moving faster now as she pushed through the shadows, the darkness clawing at her, trying to drag her back. The light grew stronger, more distinct, until it was no longer a faint glimmer, but a blazing beacon cutting through the endless blackness. Lily stumbled toward it, her pulse hammering in her ears. And just as the figures reached out for her, their cold hands brushing against her skin, she reached the light. It enveloped her, warm and bright, a stark contrast to the suffocating chill of the void. For a moment, everything went silent. Everything stopped. The darkness receded, the figures fading into the distance as the light pulled her through. And then Lily was free. She gasped, her body shaking as she collapsed to the ground. She was back in the real world. The antique store stood before her, the door ajar, the familiar scent of dust and old wood filling her lungs. She blinked, disoriented, unsure of how she had returned. The Hello Kitty figurine sat on the shelf, still pristine, still waiting for its next victim. Lily stood up slowly, her hands trembling, her mind racing to process what had just happened. Was it real, or had it all been a nightmare? Her eyes drifted back to the figurine, and for the first time since she had entered the store, she realized just how deeply she feared it. The curse was real, and it would never truly let her go. She turned quickly, running for the door, desperate to escape, to forget. But just as her fingers touched the handle, a voice echoed in her mind, the same hollow whisper that had followed her in the darkness. You can never outrun it. Her breath caught in her throat as the door slammed shut with an eerie finality, and from the corner of her eye, she saw the figurine move, just slightly, as if it were watching her, waiting. Lily's heart skipped a beat, her blood running cold as the door seemed to hum with a strange, unnatural energy. She glanced at the Hello Kitty figurine again, her pulse quickening. It was impossible. She had just left that darkness, that void. She had escaped, but the feeling of being trapped never truly left her. The figurine, once an innocent relic, now seemed like a ticking time bomb, its painted smile mocking her every move. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the handle again, but as her hand made contact, she froze. A soft creak echoed from behind her. The room seemed to darken slightly, the air thickening with something unnatural. Lily slowly turned, her breath catching in her throat. The Hello Kitty figurine was gone. Her eyes darted across the store, scanning every shelf, every corner. But it wasn't there. Her mind screamed, panic clawing at her chest as the room grew colder, the shadows deepening, stretching across the floor like fingers reaching for her. Suddenly, the store's lights flickered, and she heard the faintest sound, a soft giggle. It wasn't human. It was high-pitched, childish, yet somehow chilling. Lily spun toward the back of the store, her legs refusing to move faster. And there, in the farthest corner, under a pile of forgotten trinkets, she saw it. The figurine, But it wasn't sitting innocently on the shelf anymore. It was standing, with its head tilted slightly, as if waiting, watching her. Her blood ran cold as her eyes locked with its unblinking, soulless gaze. The smile, that twisted, sinister smile. She could hear the faint whisper again, that same hollow voice, growing louder, more insistent. "You should have left." Lily took a step back, but the figurine seemed to move closer with each breath she took, its porcelain body gliding across the floor, silently, like it was floating. Her chest tightened as the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on her, pressing her toward the cursed object. The lights above her flickered again, throwing the room into a strange, flickering half-light. And then she heard it, a faint scrape, like nails dragging across the floor. It was coming from the figurine. It was coming from the figurine itself. She couldn't breathe. Her legs gave way beneath her, but she caught herself on the edge of a shelf, her fingers curling into the rough wood. The figurine's head turned slowly, a soft crackling sound filling the silence. Lily gasped as she watched the cracks in the porcelain deepen, spreading across its face like the web of some ancient spider. And then, in a moment of sheer horror, the smile on the Hello Kitty figurine widened, impossibly wide. The thing moved. It began to walk toward her, dragging its cracked body across the floor, the broken porcelain scraping against the wood with an agonizing screech. Lily's heart thundered in her chest, and she scrambled backward, desperate for escape. But the door was still locked. She screamed, her voice barely a whisper as the darkened figure loomed closer, its jagged smile creeping ever nearer. "Why did you touch it?" it hissed, the voice impossibly loud, echoing in her ears like 100 whispers. "Why did you disturb me?" Lily reached for anything to defend herself, her trembling hands falling upon a rusted old candle holder. She held it up, ready to swing it at the approaching figure, but it was futile. The closer it came, the more the air around her seemed to thicken, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She could barely see, the edges of her vision darkening. And then, as she swung the candle holder with every ounce of her remaining strength, it disappeared. The Hello Kitty figurine vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but the dark silence of the room. Lily stood there, panting, her heart still racing as the adrenaline faded. She blinked, confused, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Had she imagined it? Was it all in her head? But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something. A small white bow. It was on the floor, just beyond the shelf where the figurine had once stood, and attached to it, the faintest trace of something dark, something wet. Lily froze. Her fingers gripped the candle holder harder as the whisper returned, but this time it wasn't from the figurine. It was coming from inside her head. "You are never free." A chill ran down her spine as the sound of soft, broken giggles echoed once more. And in the cold silence that followed, Lily realized with horror that the Hello Kitty figurine would always be with her. And the curse it carried was just beginning. That Lily's hand trembled as she stared at the small, white bow on the floor, her mind struggling to process the creeping dread that began to crawl up her spine. The silence was deafening now, save for the soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound that seemed to echo from the walls. Her heart hammered in her chest as she hesitated. Was she losing her grip on reality? Was this all in her head, or was something far worse still lurking in the shadows? She reached for the bow, her fingers brushing the soft fabric. But as soon as her skin made contact, the temperature around her plummeted. A sudden gust of wind howled through the room, extinguishing the candles, leaving her in near total darkness. Lily's breath caught in her throat, her pulse racing. She could feel the presence behind her again, that suffocating weight of something unseen yet unbearably close. The giggles returned, growing louder, more disjointed, like broken music from an old, haunted radio. The bow, now clenched in her hand, felt alive. It throbbed with a dark energy, pulsing as if it had its own heartbeat. Lily pulled her hand away, horrified, but it was too late. The room began to warp. The walls stretched outward, the floor rising like a wave beneath her feet. The once familiar store distorted around her, bending and twisting into an alien landscape, a world born of nightmares and broken memories. And there, in the center of it all, stood the Hello Kitty figurine again. But it wasn't the same. It was different. Its porcelain face was cracked and twisted, its painted eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. And its smile, oh, that smile, it was wider now, too wide, stretching impossibly far, almost grotesque in its glee. Lily's stomach churned as she stepped back, the weight of the figurine's gaze pressing down on her. It was watching her, waiting. Suddenly, the voice spoke again, closer, more intimate than before. "Did you think you could leave? Did you think you could escape the curse?" It was low, mocking, yet full of a twisted, sickening sweetness. Lily backed away, her legs faltering beneath her. Her mind screamed for her to run, to get out, but she couldn't move. The very air had become thick, suffocating, heavy with a presence that was far older than anything she could comprehend. "You took something that didn't belong to you," the voice continued, now echoing around her, filling the room, wrapping around her like a coil. "And now you are mine." Lily's hands shook as she reached out toward the door, desperately clawing at the handle. But it wouldn't budge. The figurine, its hollow eyes, followed her every move, the malevolent energy in the room growing with each passing second. Her breath quickened as panic threatened to overtake her. She turned back to face the Hello Kitty figurine. Its cracked face seemed to mock her, its smile stretched impossibly wide. Suddenly, the figurine spoke. The words were soft at first, barely a whisper, but they filled her mind with chilling clarity. "You're already here, Lily. You've always been here." Her mind reeled, unable to process the words. Asterisk, asterisk, always, asterisk, asterisk, the voice echoed, now a chorus of hundreds, merging into one single, overwhelming presence. "You were never meant to leave. You opened the door, and now the door will close forever." Lily felt her pulse racing in her throat, panic clawing at her chest. The figurine's body began to twitch, its porcelain limbs snapping into unnatural positions, as if something was forcing it to move. The bow she had touched earlier appeared in her hand again, though it had changed. It wasn't just a simple accessory anymore. It was alive, shifting and pulsing with the same dark energy that had consumed the room. Her eyes went wide with terror as the bow wrapped itself tightly around her wrist, pulling her toward the figurine. She fought against it, struggling, but the more she tried to pull away, the tighter it squeezed. The giggling grew louder, more distorted, more frantic. The walls seemed to close in around her, the ceiling lowering, the floor rising, the store morphing into something utterly alien, something unnatural. The figurine's eyes gleamed with that same evil light, its smile stretching even further, until it was no longer even recognizable as a smile. "Join us, Lily," it whispered, and the words felt like ice-cold fingers running up her spine. "There's no escape." And then, with one final, heart-stopping moment, the store vanished altogether. The world turned black, and Lily was alone, with only the whisper of that voice in her mind. "You'll never be free." And in the darkness, the giggles, they never stopped. The silence after the giggles was suffocating, a heavy, unnatural stillness that pressed in on every side. Lily's eyes strained to see, but all that surrounded her was an endless void, darker than the night itself. Her heartbeat was deafening in her ears, a constant, frantic thrum as her hands trembled uncontrollably at her sides. Was this death? Had she crossed over into another realm, one where time didn't exist, where the curse had claimed her entirely. She could still feel the pull of the bow wrapped around her wrist, its cold, damp threads tightening, constricting with every panicked breath she took. Suddenly, the darkness was shattered by a flickering light. At first, it was so faint, so distant, that she thought it was just a trick of her mind, a brief flare of hope that would quickly vanish. But then, the light grew stronger, more intense, and Lily's heart surged with a strange mixture of relief and fear. The void seemed to bend, twisting around the light as if it was drawn to it, almost afraid of it. The light pulsed, rhythmic and steady, like a heartbeat, and as it grew closer, she could make out its source. The Hello Kitty figurine. It floated in the air, suspended like a twisted, broken beacon in the middle of the black nothingness. Its porcelain body cracked in places, its once innocent face now a grotesque parody of itself, with a wide, jagged smile that stretched across its face, its eyes hollow, glowing with that same malevolent fire. Lily's breath caught in her throat as it moved, gliding toward her with an unnatural ease. The very space around it seemed to warp, bending to its will. "No," she whispered, backing away, but there was nowhere to go. The void stretched on endlessly, trapping her in this nightmarish reality. "You're here now, Lily," the voice echoed again, this time so close. It felt as though the words were being whispered directly into her soul. "You belong to me, to the curse." Lily's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her skin. She wasn't sure if she was still alive, if this was even real, but she refused to give in. She refused to be consumed. Her mind raced for a way out, some shred of hope, something, anything that could help her break free of the curse. But the figurine's presence was overwhelming. The light it emitted pulsed with an almost hypnotic power, drawing her in, pulling her closer, until she was paralyzed by its glow. The whispers began again, this time louder, more insistent. "You should have never touched it, Lily." The words repeated over and over, like a mantra, a broken record, echoing in her mind until she could feel the weight of them pressing down on her chest. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void, consumed by the overwhelming presence of the figurine. And then something shifted. The figurine spoke again, but this time its voice was no longer playful or mocking. It was cold, full of darkness, its tone dripping with malice. "You think you can fight it?" it asked, its smile widening impossibly. "There is no escape. I am everywhere. I am in your thoughts. I am in your nightmares. I am in you." The bow around Lily's wrist tightened, biting into her skin, and the pain was so intense that it felt as though her entire body was being crushed under an invisible weight. She staggered, her knees buckling, and fell to the ground. The darkness seemed to laugh with her, swirling around her like a suffocating storm. But deep within the whirlwind of horror and despair, Lily's mind flashed a memory. A moment when she had been drawn to the figurine in the first place, her curiosity leading her to it, despite the warnings. The words she had heard at that time echoed in her memory. Some things were never meant to be touched. Some things will curse you, and you'll never escape. And now, those words had come back to haunt her. Lily closed her eyes tightly, trying to block out the overwhelming presence of the figurine, but its whispers were impossible to ignore. Asterisk, asterisk, you are mine now. Asterisk, asterisk. But suddenly the word stopped. The light flickered again, the once steady pulse fading, becoming erratic, weak. The figurine's smile faltered, its eyes narrowing, the glow dimming. For the briefest moment, Lily thought, asterisk hoped asterisk, that something had changed. Maybe it was weakening. Maybe there was a chance. But then, everything went dark. No more whispers. No more light. No more presence. Just an unbearable, suffocating silence. Lily was alone again. She opened her eyes, unsure of where she was, but the void had vanished, replaced by an oppressive, infinite blackness. But then she noticed something. The bow. It was no longer around her wrist. She lifted her hand to look at it, expecting to see the same dark, pulsing thread. But there was nothing. She was free? Lily's breath came in shallow, relieved gasps, her pulse slowly returning to a more natural rhythm. Could it be? Was she finally free? But then, as if in answer to her question, a soft giggle echoed through the void once more. The familiar, broken laugh. And Lily's heart sank as she realized that freedom had never truly been an option. She had only ever been waiting. The curse had never let go. It had simply waited. The giggle reverberated around her, an eerie, sickly sound that made her skin crawl. Lily's breath caught in her throat as the darkness began to shift once more. She stood frozen, the weight of realization settling heavily in her chest. She was not free, not by a long shot. The very air around her seemed to move, shifting and pulsing, as if alive. The once absolute blackness now began to twist and distort, forming shapes. Asterisk shapes that she recognized. Asterisk. The Hello Kitty figurine. It hovered just out of her reach, floating eerily, its jagged smile leering at her from the shadows. Its porcelain face was cracked beyond recognition, but its hollow eyes burned with an insidious light, and it was getting closer. "You thought you could escape," it whispered, its voice a twisted mockery of childlike innocence. Lily stumbled backward, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to give way, as if the very space she stood on was falling apart. The figurine's voice continued, as cold as the void that surrounded her. "Did you really think it would end like that? You think you can run from me?" The light in the figurine's eyes flared, and for a brief, horrifying moment, Lily saw her own reflection, distorted, corrupted. Asterisk, asterisk, inside asterisk, asterisk, the empty, glowing sockets. Her chest tightened, her throat constricting in fear. No, no, she couldn't go back there. She couldn't. The whispers around her grew louder, more frantic, filling the void with a chorus of voices, each one twisting together until it was impossible to distinguish them. Forever, they chanted in unison, forever, forever, forever. Lily felt herself being drawn in, her body frozen as if some unseen force was pulling her toward the figurine. The darkness thickened around her, suffocating her with its weight. She reached out, her hands trembling, but the Hello Kitty figurine was too far now. She could feel the curse tightening its grip on her, its cold fingers wrapping around her heart. The giggles returned, louder this time, almost maniacal in their intensity. And then she saw it. The bow. The same white bow that had been wrapped around her wrist. It was floating in the air, glowing faintly with the same cursed light. Lily reached for it, desperation driving her forward. But as her fingers brushed against the bow, everything went still. The room, the void, the darkness. Everything froze. A single, agonizingly long moment passed, before the silence was shattered by one final, bone-chilling whisper. Asterisk, asterisk, you will never leave, asterisk, asterisk. The bow burned in her hand, its fabric twisting and writhing as if it were alive, feeding off her fear, feeding off her soul. The ground beneath her feet gave way, and Lily fell. No, was dragged into the endless abyss, the cursed laughter echoing around her. She screamed, but it was swallowed by the void, the darkness consuming her very essence. The bow, now tied tightly around her wrist once again, dragged her down. There was no escape. The Hello Kitty figurine, once an innocent relic, now stood at the edge of the abyss, watching, waiting for the next soul to fall, for the next victim to touch the cursed thing. And Lily was lost forever, her name and her essence consumed by the darkness. The curse had no end. It was always waiting, the abyss stretched infinitely before her, an endless chasm that seemed to swallow every trace of light and sound. Lily's body felt weightless, like she was falling through an endless void, each second dragging on for eternity. Her heart beat wildly in her chest, but even her frantic thoughts seemed muffled, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. She couldn't breathe. It felt like her lungs were collapsing, the air around her thick and suffocating. The world around her had no edges, no direction, no escape. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath her feet was solid again. But it wasn't a floor she recognized. It was rough, cold, ancient stone. Lily's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing as her feet hit the ground, her body jerking from the shock of it. She stumbled forward, her arms instinctively reaching out to steady herself. The air was thick with dust, and the faintest trace of mildew clung to the atmosphere. She was no longer in the void. She was in a place, a room. But it wasn't a room she'd ever seen before. The walls were made of stone, dark and weathered, adorned with strange, arcane symbols that pulsed faintly, their twisted shapes and jagged lines seeming to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. She looked around, panic surging through her. The room was dimly lit by flickering torches, their flames casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance and sway like living things. And there, in the center of the room, was the Hello Kitty figurine. But it was no longer just a figurine. It was something else, something darker. The porcelain body had cracked completely, its jagged pieces now jutting out in unnatural angles, almost like claws. The smile, twisted and impossibly wide, stretched across its face. But its eyes, they were gone. Only empty black sockets remained, two deep voids where once innocent eyes had been. Lily felt the bow around her wrist grow cold, pulling tighter, as if sensing her fear. It seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, almost like a heartbeat, and it dragged her forward. She didn't want to move. She couldn't. But her feet, her body, were no longer under her control. She was being pulled. Closer. Closer. Each step felt like she was moving deeper into the cursed presence that had haunted her. The giggles returned, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the room. They came from everywhere, swirling around her, making it impossible to tell where they originated. "Why did you fight me?" the voice of the Hello Kitty figurine crooned, now a twisted whisper in the air. "You should have accepted it. You should have been mine from the beginning." Lily tried to scream, but her voice was lost, drowned in the relentless pressure of the room. Her body was shaking now, uncontrollably, as she was drawn nearer to the figurine. She could almost hear its hollow breath, an eerie, raspy sound that sent chills down her spine. The bow tightened again. Lily couldn't take it anymore. Her hands shot up, desperately trying to pull it off her wrist, but it was no use. The bow was attached, rooted. She screamed, her voice finally breaking free, but it didn't matter. The bow glowed, pulsating with an intensity that made her eyes burn. The whispers grew louder, melding into one giant, horrible cacophony of sound, spinning her into madness. And then, with a violent jerk, the bow pulled. Everything was torn apart. The room, the figurine, the symbols, the air itself. All of it shattered. Lily fell again, but this time it was not into the abyss. This time there was nothing. No light. No sound. Nothing. The curse had claimed her completely. And in the darkest, most silent corner of the room, the Hello Kitty figurine smiled. It always smiles, waiting for the next soul to fall, the next soul to touch it. The curse never ends, and so, as the last echo of Lily's scream faded into nothingness, the room returned to its stillness, its eerie silence. The cursed bow, now lifeless and still, hung in the air like a forgotten memory. The Hello Kitty figurine, its cracked and broken form, stood in the center of the room, its dark, hollow eyes now empty. Asterisk, asterisk, waiting, asterisk, asterisk. It had claimed another, adding another soul to its twisted collection. But the curse, the hunger, was never satisfied. No, the curse would always wait, for there was always another curious soul, another unsuspecting hand, another innocent touch. Somewhere out there, someone would stumble upon the store again. Someone would be drawn to the innocent-looking trinkets, to the playful smile of a porcelain cat. They would touch it, take it in their hands, thinking it harmless, thinking it nothing more than a collectible. And the cycle would begin again. The giggles would return, the whispers would fill the air, and the bow would find its next victim. The curse never grew tired. It never rested. It simply waited. And Lily was now just a part of the room, a part of the story, a part of the curse that would never be forgotten, never be released. The darkness in the room deepened. The figurine, with its wide, twisted smile, watched, and it waited forever.